My mother showed up at my front door after disappearing for 9 years, holding a handwritten list of dollar amounts. Not an apology. Not pictures. Not even a question about how I'd been. Just numbers. $925,000, written line by line like she'd been preparing it for months. And the strangest part, she acted like the last 9 years had never happened. Like she didn't send my wedding photos back unopened. Like my father didn't tell the entire church I was dead to the family. Like any of it could just disappear. She kept talking while I stood there holding the paper. Calm, confident, certain I would help her. Until I walked to the kitchen, opened a navy binder, and placed it on the table between us. Because every year she ignored me was already documented inside it. And when she saw the first page, her face changed instantly. The first thing I noticed was the suitcase. Dark gray, scratched near the wheels. The kind of suitcase people use when they plan to stay longer than they admit. It sat beside my mother's legs while she stood on my porch like she belonged there. 9 years. 9 full years since I had last heard her voice. And somehow she still knocked the same way. 3 short taps. Pause. 1 more. Like muscle memory survives longer than relationships do. But there she was. Older, thinner, more careful around the eyes. Still wearing the same silver cross necklace she used to twist between her fingers whenever she lied about being fine. And in her right hand was folded notebook paper. I didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. We just stood there looking at each other while the late afternoon wind pushed leaves across the porch between us. Then she smiled. Not warmly. Politely. Like we were distant relatives meeting unexpectedly at a grocery store. Hi, Iris. That was the moment it became real. Because hearing her say my name again after almost a decade felt stranger than seeing her standing there. I kept one hand on the door. Not to slam it. Just instinct. Like some part of me already understood this wasn't a visit. It was a transaction. You moved, she said quietly, glancing past me into the house. No apology. No acknowledgement of time. Just observation. I nodded once. That happens in 9 years. The words came out flatter than I expected. Not angry. Not emotional. Just true. Her smile tightened slightly. And for a second, I saw something familiar flash across her face. Discomfort. Not guilt. Never guilt. My mother was raised to believe guilt was weakness. But discomfort. That I recognized. She adjusted her grip on the folded paper. I know this is unexpected. Unexpected. That word almost made me laugh. Like this was bad weather instead of abandonment. I waited. Because something told me she hadn't driven 3 states to discuss the passage of time. And eventually, she handed me the paper. Not dramatically. Not nervously. Almost professionally. Like she'd rehearsed this part in the car. I unfolded it slowly. At first, the numbers didn't register. Just rows of amounts written in blue ink. $80,000. $45,000. $210,000. $16,500. Line after line. Some circled. Some underlined. And at the bottom, a total, $925,000. I looked back up at her. She finally broke eye contact first. Your father's medical situation got worse, she said carefully. There are debts. Debts. Another interesting word. Because families like mine never call them mistakes. They call them situations. I scanned the paper again. Hospital balances, property liens, business losses, legal fees. $925,000 of panic squeezed into notebook paper. And somehow, she still hadn't apologized. Not once. Not for the wedding. Not for the letters. Not for disappearing. Nothing. Just numbers. That's when I knew I was right. This wasn't a reunion. It was a collection attempt. And the strange part, I wasn't even angry anymore. I think anger expires eventually. Like milk, leave it untouched long enough and it turns into something else entirely. Something colder, more organized. My mother finally looked back at me fully. We didn't know who else to ask. Why? Interesting. After 9 years, suddenly there was a we again. I looked at the paper one last time, then at the suitcase beside her feet. And finally, I stepped aside from the doorway. Not because I forgave her, because I wanted to hear how far this would go. She hesitated before entering, like even she understood the house didn't belong to her world anymore. And as she walked past me toward the kitchen, I realized something strange. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside that room, or what I had spent the last 9 years keeping. Because the moment she sat down at my kitchen table, I walked to the cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled down the navy binder. My mother noticed the binder immediately. Not because it was large, because of how carefully I handled it. Navy blue, edges worn white from years of use. A faded label on the spine with no title. Just a blank strip where something used to be written. I placed it on the kitchen table between us without opening it. And for the first time since she arrived, she looked uncertain. Not scared. Not yet. Just cautious. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller than usual. Late sunlight stretched across the countertops, catching dust in the air between us while the refrigerator hummed quietly in the background. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary light. But nothing about the moment felt ordinary. My mother sat stiffly at the edge of the chair, purse in her lap, folded demand list beside her hand like she didn't want to lose sight of it. I stayed standing for a second longer, watching her, because something about the scene felt impossible. 9 years of silence, reduced to a kitchen table and a handwritten debt sheet. You kept records, she asked carefully. Interesting choice of words. Not, what is that? Not, why do you have it? Records. Like some part of her already understood exactly what this was. I pulled the chair out slowly and sat across from her. Every year, I said. Simple. Flat. No emotion attached. And that answer changed her expression instantly. Only slightly. But enough. Because now she understood the binder wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't anger. It was history. Organized. Documented. Preserved. She glanced down at it again. Then back at me. You don't have to do this. That almost surprised me. Not because of the sentence itself. Because of the timing. She hadn't apologized for abandoning me. Hadn't apologized for the church rumors. Hadn't apologized for sending my wedding photos back unopened. But suddenly, this was the thing she wanted to stop. I rested my hand lightly on the binder. You came here asking for almost $1 million. My voice stayed calm. But you skipped over a few years. Silent. Not hostile. Heavy. My mother looked toward the kitchen window. Anywhere except directly at me. And that told me everything. Because people avoid eye contact when they already know the truth sitting across from them. You have to understand. No, I interrupted quietly. And that single word changed the room. Not louder, not emotional, just final. Because for most of my life, I let my family explain things to me. Translate events into versions that protected them. Repackage cruelty into tradition. Distance into concern. Rejection into what's best. But 9 years changes your tolerance for rewritten history. I opened the binder. Slowly. The plastic sleeves crackled softly as I turned the first page toward her. Inside was a wedding photograph. Mine. The edges bent. A bright red stamp across the front. Return to sender. My mother froze. Actually froze. Her breathing changed first. Small shift. Barely visible. But once you notice it, you can't unsee it. I remembered the exact day the envelope came back. Rain against the apartment windows. Daniel standing silently near the sink pretending not to watch me open it. Because both of us already knew. We just hadn't admitted it out loud yet. The wedding photos had been mailed to my parents 2 weeks after the ceremony. A peace offering. Or maybe a desperate attempt to keep the family alive. I included a handwritten letter too. Not angry. Not defensive. Just hopeful. And 3 weeks later, the entire package came back unopened. No note. No explanation. Just that stamp. Return to sender. My mother stared at the photo in silence. Then finally whispered, "Your father handled those." There it was again. Distance. Not. Wait. Not. I. Your father. Like responsibility could be reassigned retroactively. I leaned back slightly in my chair. And you watched. The words landed harder than I intended. Because they were true. And truth usually sounds harsher when nobody interrupts it. She swallowed carefully, hands tightening around each other in her lap. You don't understand what things were like back then. That sentence almost felt automatic. Practiced. The kind of defense people use when they know specifics won't survive scrutiny. So they retreat into atmosphere instead. Context. Pressure. Circumstances. As if environments make decisions by themselves. I turned another page. Church bulletin. Folded in half. Highlighted sentence near the center. We ask the congregation to pray for families suffering from rebellion and spiritual confusion. My mother closed her eyes briefly. Because she recognized it immediately. Of course she did. My father gave that speech 3 Sundays after my wedding. Without using my name once. And somehow every person in the church still knew exactly who he meant. I remembered sitting in my car outside afterward. Watching people leave the building. None of them called me. Not one. Because once authority labels you publicly, most people stop forming their own opinions. They borrow his instead. My mother finally looked back at me. And this time, there was something different in her expression. Not guilt. Still not guilt. Something closer to realization. Because the binder was doing something she didn't expect. It wasn't attacking her. It was removing her ability to simplify the past. Every page made the story more specific. More real. And reality becomes difficult to escape once someone organizes it properly. I turned another page. Then another. Returned Christmas cards. Screenshots of unanswered messages. A printed copy of the email where my younger brother wrote, "Dad says contacting you dishonors the family. My mother stared at the pages like she was seeing them for the first time. Maybe she was. Because people experience cruelty differently when it's scattered across years. But put it together in one place. It stops feeling accidental. And suddenly, the $925,000 list sitting beside her hand didn't look nearly as large anymore. Then she saw the hospital receipt near the middle of the binder and quietly asked the one question she should have asked 9 years earlier. Her eyes stopped on the receipt instantly. White paper, folded twice, hospital logo faded near the top corner. And beneath it, Daniel's name. My mother frowned slightly. Not confusion, recognition trying to catch up. Then she looked at the date. 8 years ago. Only a year after the wedding. What happened? She asked quietly. And there it was. The question. Small, late, but finally real. I looked down at the receipt for a second before answering. Because some memories don't disappear. They just settle deeper. Car accident, I said. Her expression changed immediately. Tiny shift around the eyes. The kind people can't fully control. He was driving home from work. I didn't add drama to it. Didn't need to. Reality already carries enough weight when you stop decorating it. Rain had covered the highway that night. A delivery truck lost control 2 lanes over. 3 cars hit the divider. Daniel spent 6 hours in surgery while I sat alone under fluorescent hospital lights trying to understand how life could change that fast. My family knew. That part mattered. Because they absolutely knew. I had called my mother twice that night. And once the next morning. No answer. Not even voicemail. I turned the receipt over carefully. Attached behind it was a printed screenshot. One sentence highlighted in yellow. Your father says it would be inappropriate for us to get involved. My mother stared at the page without moving. And for the first time since entering my house, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not defensive. Not careful. Just affected. I remembered reading that message while sitting beside Daniel's hospital bed. His arm in a cast. Machines beeping steadily beside him. And somehow, that text hurt worse than the accident itself. Because accidents are random. But rejection, that's chosen. My mother finally spoke. I didn't know he sent that. I nodded slowly. I figured. And that answer landed heavily between us. Because not knowing wasn't innocence. Not after years of silence. Not after every ignored birthday. Every returned card. Every family gathering I stopped existing in. Silence becomes participation eventually. People just prefer not to call it that. She rubbed her hands together quietly. A nervous habit she'd had my entire life. Usually right before difficult conversations. I wanted to reach out. There it was. The almost apology. Not fully formed. Still protecting itself. I looked at her carefully. Then why didn't you? Simple question. No accusation. No raised voice. And somehow that made it harder for her to answer. Because emotional people can argue with anger. Calmness is harder. Calmness leaves nowhere to hide. She looked toward the binder again instead of me. Things were complicated. Another vague phrase. Another foggy explanation meant to soften sharp edges. I almost let it go. Almost. But something about the $925,000 list sitting beside her elbow kept pulling me back to clarity. You drove 3 states to ask me for money, I said quietly. So let's not pretend honesty is the difficult part. That one hit. I could see it immediately. Her shoulders tightened slightly. And for a second, she looked older than when she first arrived. Not physically, emotionally. Like the energy required to maintain the old version of events was finally becoming exhausting. The kitchen stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "How long have you kept all this?" I glanced down at the binder. Since the first envelope came back. That answer mattered. Because this wasn't revenge collected suddenly. It was grief archived slowly. Year after year. Page after page. I remembered buying the binder at an office supply store near our old apartment. At first, it was supposed to hold financial paperwork, medical bills, insurance forms. But after the second returned Christmas card, I added that too. Then the unanswered emails. Then the church bulletin. Eventually, the binder became something else entirely. Proof. Not for them. For me. Because when enough people erase you at once, you start needing reminders that it actually happened. My mother's eyes moved slowly across the pages again. And now something else had entered the room. Not just discomfort. Perspective. Because until now, the last 9 years probably felt abstract to her. A regrettable period. An unfortunate family separation. Something that happened. But the binder changed that. It transformed years into evidence. Specific. Chronological. Impossible to soften with vague language. I turned another page carefully. There, inside a plastic sleeve, was a photograph from my younger brother's wedding. Everyone smiling beneath white garden lights. My parents, my aunts, my cousins, even church friends. Everyone except me. My mother inhaled sharply. Probably because she realized something. I wasn't supposed to have that picture. But people always leak information eventually. Especially when guilt starts bothering them quietly at night. They said inviting you would create tension, she whispered. I looked at the photo calmly. They were right. She closed her eyes briefly. And this time, I saw it. Actual regret. Small, fragile, but real. The problem was, regret after 9 years feels very different than regret after 9 days. Time changes the shape of forgiveness. Sometimes permanently. My mother opened her mouth slightly like she wanted to say something important. Then stopped herself. And honestly, that was probably wise. Because there are moments where explanations stop helping. Where every additional sentence only makes the silence underneath more obvious. Finally, she looked at me again. Directly, and in a voice much smaller than before. She asked, "Did you really think we'd never come back?" I stared at her for a second. Then slowly closed the binder halfway. "No," I said honestly. "I just didn't think it would happen after you needed something." And that sentence changed her face completely. Because some truths don't sound cruel until someone says them out loud. Then my mother looked down at the binder again. Stopped at a page near the back. And realized I had documented something even worse than the rejection itself. My mother turned the next page herself. Slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of what might be underneath it. And honestly, she should have been. Because up until now, the binder had mostly documented absence. Silence, rejection, distance. But this section was different. This part wasn't about what my family failed to do. It was about what happened after they disappeared. The page she stopped on held a photograph. Small, glossy, slightly bent near the corner. Daniel sitting beside a folding table in our first apartment. 2 laptops open. Receipts scattered everywhere. Chinese takeout containers pushed to one side. It looked ordinary, almost unimpressive, until you understood when it was taken. 3 months after the hospital accident. 2 months after we lost our apartment. 1 week after Daniel got released from physical therapy. My mother stared at the picture quietly. "What is this?" "The beginning," I said. And those 2 words carried more emotion than anything else I had said all evening. Because people love dramatic success stories. What they don't love is the middle, the humiliating part, the unstable part. The nights where you sit on a folding chair, wondering whether your electricity gets shut off next month. That's the part nobody celebrates afterward. But that's where our life actually changed. I leaned back slightly in my chair. After the accident, Daniel couldn't go back to work right away. My mother stayed silent. Listening now. Really listening. The medical bills got worse, insurance fought everything. We burned through savings in under 6 months. I tapped the edge of the photograph lightly. So we started working from home. The memory returned instantly. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee almost every night because we kept forgetting the pot on while running numbers. Daniel taught himself data modeling from online forums while recovering. I handled contract analysis for small investment groups willing to hire remotely. It wasn't glamorous. Most months it barely worked. But little by little, it grew. My mother looked confused. Not about the story. About the timeline. Because for the first time, she was realizing something enormous. Everything she admired about me now was built during the exact years my family erased me. That changes people. Especially parents. I opened the binder again and slid another document toward her. Business registration papers. Northline Capital. Year 1. My mother stared at the company name for several seconds. "You started it there." I nodded once. In the apartment above a laundromat. That finally broke something in her expression. Not dramatically. Quietly. Because suddenly the success story stopped looking polished. Now it had context. Pain. Risk. Humiliation. I remembered those nights perfectly. Daniel limping slightly between the kitchen and table because his leg still hadn't healed properly. Me sleeping 4 hours at a time. Both of us pretending not to notice overdue notices taped to the mailbox downstairs. And somehow, those years still remain the happiest period of my life. Not because they were easy. Because they were honest. Nobody was performing. Nobody was managing appearances. We were just trying to survive together. My mother touched the edge of the registration paper gently. Almost absent-mindedly. Why didn't anyone know about this? I almost smiled at that question. Because the answer was painfully simple. Would it have mattered? Silence again. But different now. Not defensive. Reflective. Because she already knew the answer. If the company had failed, my family never would have come back. Success reopened the door. Not love. Not regret. Success. That realization sat heavily between us. I reached for another page. A printed email exchange. Subject line. Loan request DENIED. My mother frowned. I slid it closer. This was 2 years after the wedding. She read quietly, then stopped halfway through, because she recognized my father's writing immediately. Short sentences. Formal tone. Emotion removed completely. Associating financially with your situation would send the wrong message to the family. My mother covered her mouth briefly, and suddenly I remembered the exact moment that email arrived. Daniel asleep on the couch. Electric bill overdue again. Our bank account at $312. I had stared at the rejection email for nearly 20 minutes before replying. And in the end, I never answered it at all. Not because I was mature. Because I understood something for the first time. Some people only support versions of you that protect their identity. Not you. My mother lowered her hand slowly. I didn't know you asked him for help. That sentence irritated me more than I expected. Not because she said it. Because of how many times I didn't know had entered the conversation tonight. At some point, not knowing becomes its own decision. You didn't ask, I said calmly. And there it was again. The truth she kept circling without wanting to touch directly. Because families like mine survive through selective awareness. Everyone notices enough to maintain the system. Nobody notices enough to challenge it. I stood up quietly and walked toward the kitchen counter. Not dramatically. Just knighting movement. The kettle sat where I left it earlier. I filled it halfway with water while my mother remained completely silent behind me. You know the strange part, I said softly without turning around. We stopped talking about all of you after a while. That caught her off guard. I could hear it in the silence immediately. Not because we stopped caring, I continued, but because survival takes up too much space. The kettle clicked softly onto its base. And eventually your absence became normal. That sentence hurt her. I knew it did. Because some pain comes from rejection. But different pain comes from realizing people learned how to live peacefully without you. I finally turned back toward the table. And my mother was staring at the binder like it had become something much heavier than paper. Because now she understood the worst part. The binder wasn't documenting revenge. It was documenting a life my family chose not to witness. Then my mother reached the final section near the back of the binder. And found the page that made her start crying before she even finished reading it. My mother hesitated before turning the next page. Not because she didn't want to continue. Because now she understood every page cost something. And somehow, that made the binder feel heavier than the $925,000 she brought into my house. The plastic sleeve crackled softly as she flipped forward. Then she stopped. Completely. At first, I thought she was reading silently. But after a few seconds, I realized she wasn't moving at all. Just staring. The page held a single document. No photographs. No emails. No returned envelopes. Just one hospital intake form. Small pediatric clinic logo near the top. Patient name. Emma Carter. My daughter. My mother's granddaughter. A granddaughter she had never met. Her hand covered her mouth instantly. And for the first time that entire evening, I saw emotion hit her before she had time to control it. Not discomfort. Not regret. Grief. Real grief. She was sick, my mother whispered. I stayed quiet for a second. Because this was the page I never planned to show anyone. Not even Daniel at first. Some things hurt differently once they're spoken out loud. Finally, I nodded. She was born early. My mother's eyes filled immediately. Not dramatic crying. Not movie tears. Just the kind that appear silently when reality arrives too fast. I remembered that winter perfectly. Emma weighed barely 4 pounds. Tiny fingers. Weak lungs. Machines surrounding her crib for the first 3 weeks. And through all of it, my family never knew she existed. Not because I hid her, because by then, I had stopped expecting anyone to come back. My mother stared at the intake form like she was trying to force time backward through willpower alone. Then she noticed the attached note clipped behind it. A handwritten sentence from Daniel. She opened her eyes when you sang. That broke her completely. The first tear slid down her cheek before she even realized it happened. And honestly, that was the moment the conversation changed forever. Because until now, the binder documented rejection between adults. Painful, yes, but explainable. Families fight. People choose sides. Parents fail children. It happens. But grandchildren, that's different. Children expose the true cost of pride faster than anything else. My mother wiped at her face quickly, almost embarrassed. When was this? 7 years ago. Her breathing became uneven immediately. 7 years. 7 birthdays. 7 Christmas mornings. 7 years of school pictures. Lost. Gone. And all because my father decided my marriage embarrassed him publicly. I sat back down slowly across from her. Not angry anymore. Not even satisfied. Just tired. Because carrying years like this exhausts you eventually. My mother kept staring at Emma's name. Like memorizing it could somehow repair the missing years. She's 7 now. I nodded once. She likes astronomy and strawberry ice cream. The sentence came out softer than I expected. Because talking about Emma always changes my voice slightly. Children do that. My mother cried harder at that. Quietly, hands covering part of her face now. And somewhere deep inside me, something shifted unexpectedly. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perspective. Because this was the first moment all night where she stopped defending the past. Stopped explaining. Stopped repositioning responsibility. Now she was simply experiencing the consequences of it. Directly. And consequences feel very different than arguments. I would have come, she whispered brokenly. That sentence sat in the kitchen for several seconds before I answered. I know. And surprisingly, I meant it. That was the complicated part. I genuinely believed she would have come for Emma. The problem was, she allowed someone else to decide when love was permitted. And eventually that permission system consumed everything. My mother wiped her eyes carefully. Then looked toward me again. Older now somehow. Smaller. What does she know about us? Interesting question. Not, can I meet her? Not, does she hate us? Just, what does she know? I thought about it honestly. Not much. That seemed to hurt almost as badly as the intake form. Because children create permanence. Once a child grows up without you, you can't recover those years later. You can build something new. Maybe. But you cannot reclaim first steps. First birthdays. First words. Those belong to time. And time never returns anything. My mother looked back down at the binder again. Then finally noticed something else clipped near the back section. Dozens of photographs. Emma growing year after year. Halloween costumes. School concerts. Birthday cakes. Family vacations. A complete childhood. And my family was absent from every single frame. She reached toward the photos carefully but stopped halfway. Like she wasn't sure she had the right. That hesitation mattered more to me than any apology could have. Because finally, she understood the scale of what was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The kettle behind me clicked softly as the water finished heating. Neither of us moved. Outside, evening shadows stretched slowly across the kitchen floor while the house stayed completely silent except for my mother trying unsuccessfully to steady her breathing. Then she asked the question I think she had been avoiding since she first saw the binder. "Does your father know about her?" I looked directly at her. No. Her eyes closed immediately. Because now she understood something terrifying. The man who spent 9 years protecting the family's reputation didn't even know he had a granddaughter. And suddenly, the $925,000 sitting beside the binder felt unbelievably small. Then my mother looked at me through tears and asked if she could meet Emma. But before I answered, there was one final page in the binder she still hadn't seen. My mother's voice barely held together when she asked, "Can I meet her?" The question stayed suspended between us while the kitchen grew quieter around it. I didn't answer immediately. Not to punish her, because this wasn't a small request. Meeting Emma wasn't the same as reopening communication. Children change the stakes of everything, especially after abandonment. My mother must have understood that because for the first time all evening, she didn't push, didn't explain, didn't defend herself. She just waited. And honestly, that patience affected me more than tears had. I looked down at the binder slowly. At the pages spread across the table like evidence from a life trial nobody realized they were participating in. Then I reached toward the back cover. "There's one more thing," I said quietly. My mother's expression tightened immediately. Not fear exactly, but preparation. Because by now she understood the pattern. Every section of the binder revealed something worse than the last. I slid out the final page carefully. Unlike everything else inside the binder, this one wasn't old. The paper was clean. Sharp corners. Recent. My mother took it with slightly shaking hands. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then her eyes moved toward the top line. And everything in her face changed. Legal notice of estate liquidation. Below it, my grandfather's name. Her father. I watched confusion hit her first. Then the realization. Then something deeper. "No," she whispered. I stayed quiet. Because there wasn't a gentle way to explain this. My grandfather died 11 months earlier. Massive heart attack. Quick. Unexpected. But before he died, he had cut my parents out quietly. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But legally. And before my mother could ask the obvious question. Yes, I knew before everyone else. Because despite everything that happened with my parents, my grandfather never fully cut contact. Not publicly. Never openly. But quietly. Through birthday cards. Small college checks. One secret phone call every Christmas Eve after everyone else went to sleep. He never defended me in front of the family. That part still hurt. But he also never erased me completely. And in families like mine, that almost counts as courage. My mother stared at the document in disbelief. Nobody told me about this. I know. That answer landed heavily. Because now she was experiencing the exact same thing she helped create. Exclusion. Silence. Important life events happening without you. The difference was, hers lasted 11 months. Mine lasted 9 years. She sat frozen while reading further down the page. Property sold. Assets divided. Estate closed. Finalized. And then she reached the handwritten note clipped to the back. My grandfather's handwriting had become shakier near the end of his life, but still recognizable. Short sentence. Simple. Direct. Leave this to Iris. She remembers people after they stop being useful. My mother broke instantly. Not loud. Not dramatic. But complete. Her shoulders folded inward while tears dropped silently onto the paper in her hands. Because suddenly the binder stopped being about punishment. Now it was reflection. A mirror held up to an entire family system built around loyalty, appearances, and selective love. And the worst part, my grandfather saw it before he died. I leaned back quietly in my chair, emotionally exhausted now. Because carrying years like this takes energy even when you survive them successfully. My mother wiped at her eyes again. But it didn't help much anymore. When did he write this? A few weeks before he died. That seemed to hurt her even more. Because somewhere underneath the grief, she understood another truth. My grandfather trusted me with his honesty more than he trusted his own daughter. The kitchen stayed silent for a long time after that. No defenses left now. No explanations. No carefully chosen language. Just reality sitting openly on the table between us. Finally, my mother looked up at me again. And this time, she didn't look like the woman who arrived at my front door with a suitcase and debt list. She looked like someone trying to understand how many years she lost while convincing herself she was protecting the family. I thought time would fix things, she whispered. That sentence hit differently because it was honest. Wrong, but honest. I nodded slowly. A lot of people think that. Because distance creates illusions. People assume silence pauses consequences. But silence actually feeds them. Year after year. Quietly. Until eventually the emotional debt becomes too large to repay all at once. My mother looked down at the estate papers again. Then toward the money list beside her hand. And for the first time since she arrived, she slowly folded the list closed. That mattered. More than any apology. Because it meant something had finally shifted internally. The money was no longer the center of the conversation. The family was. Or what remained of it. I shouldn't have come here like this, she said quietly. No defense attached. No conditions. Just the truth. And I could tell she hated how long it took her to arrive there. I looked toward the hallway instinctively. Emma was upstairs at a friend's house for the evening. She'd be home soon. My mother noticed the glance immediately. And suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed again. Because now the conversation wasn't theoretical anymore. Now there was a possibility sitting inside the silence between us. Not forgiveness. Something smaller. More fragile. A chance. And chances after 9 years feel terrifying precisely because they matter. My mother held the binder carefully before sliding it back toward me. Almost respectfully. Like she finally understood what it actually was. Not revenge. Memory. Protected before time could rewrite it. Then she asked one final question. Very softly. Does Emma know I'm here? I looked at her for a long moment before answering. No, I said honestly. But she's coming home soon. And the fear that crossed my mother's face in that moment wasn't fear of rejection. It was fear that she might not deserve the opportunity at all. Then headlights swept across the front window, and my mother realized my daughter was about to walk through the door for the very first time. The headlights moved slowly across the front window before disappearing into the driveway. My mother went completely still. Not emotionally. Physically. Like her body suddenly forgot how to move properly. Outside, a car door shut. Then another. Muffled voices. Laughter. Normal sounds. Small sounds. But inside the kitchen, they carried enormous weight. Because after 9 years of silence, everything was suddenly becoming real at once. My mother looked toward the hallway instinctively, then back at me. Panic flickered briefly across her face for the first time all evening. Not panic about money. Not about my father. About Emma. And strangely, that made me trust her slightly more. Because fear means something matters. I closed the binder carefully. Not hiding it. Just ending that part of the conversation. You don't have to meet her tonight, I said quietly. And I meant it. Because despite everything, I wasn't trying to trap my mother emotionally. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have felt cleaner. Simpler. But real family damage never works that way. It spreads unevenly through years until nobody fully understands where it started anymore. My mother wiped beneath her eyes quickly. No, she said softly. Then corrected herself. I mean, only if you think it's okay. That sentence mattered, because it was the first time she acknowledged my authority in the situation. Not my father's. Not the family's. Mine. Outside, footsteps approached the porch. Then keys rattled against the front door. My mother inhaled sharply. And suddenly I remembered something strange. When I was little, she used to get nervous before parent-teacher conferences too. Same breathing pattern. Same twisting hands. Like being emotionally exposed always frightened her more than conflict itself. The front door opened. Cold evening air slipped briefly into the house along with Emma's voice. Mom, 7 years old. Bright energy. Backpack bouncing against one shoulder. Completely unaware that one of the biggest emotional moments of her life was waiting inside the kitchen 15 feet away. I'm in here, I called gently. My mother stood halfway from the chair. Then stopped. Uncertain again. Emma rounded the corner still talking. I forgot my science folder at. And then she saw my mother. The sentence ended instantly. Children notice emotional tension faster than adults do. Emma looked from my mother to me. Then back again. Quietly assessing. Exactly like Daniel does. My mother stared at her like the rest of the world had disappeared. And honestly, maybe it had. Because nothing else in that room mattered anymore. Not the debt list. Not the binder. Not even the past for a few seconds. Just a grandmother seeing her granddaughter for the first time. Emma stepped closer to me instinctively. Not fearful. Just uncertain. I rested a hand lightly against her shoulder. This is my mom, I said softly. I almost said, your grandmother. But the word caught in my throat. Because titles feel complicated after absences that long. Emma looked up at me briefly. Then toward my mother again. Oh, that tiny response somehow broke my mother harder than tears had. Because children don't understand emotional history. They only understand presence. And to Emma, this was simply a stranger her mother seemed emotional around. My mother's lips trembled slightly before she managed a small smile. Hi, Emma. Emma gave a cautious little wave. And suddenly I became aware of how unbelievably unfair this moment was to all three of us. To my mother, because she was confronting lost years all at once. To Emma, because she had no context for the emotions surrounding her. And to me, because I was standing between two versions of family that had never been allowed to exist together before. Emma looked at the kitchen table curiously. Children always notice objects before emotions. Her eyes landed on the binder. Then the folded debt paper. Then back to me. Are you busy? That question grounded the entire room instantly. Simple, pure, real. I smiled slightly. A little. Emma nodded thoughtfully like that answer made complete sense. Then looked toward my mother again. Do you want juice? The kindness in that question nearly destroyed my mother emotionally. Because children offer connection naturally. Without pride. Without conditions. Without years of complicated adult logic standing in the way. My mother let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. That would be nice. Emma disappeared toward the refrigerator. Completely comfortable again within seconds. Kids recover from awkwardness faster than adults ever do. Meanwhile, my mother sat slowly back down in the chair like her legs no longer fully trusted themselves. She looks like you, she whispered. I glanced toward Emma pulling juice boxes from the refrigerator. No, I said quietly. She looks like Daniel. That mattered too. Because despite everything my family said about him, despite all the rejection, the best part of my life still carried his face. Emma returned holding 2 juice boxes awkwardly against her sweater. She handed one carefully to my mother. And watching my mother accept it with shaking hands felt stranger than every page in the binder combined. Because this moment couldn't be archived later. Couldn't be documented. Couldn't be preserved neatly inside plastic sleeves. It was happening now. Messy. Uncertain. Real. Emma climbed onto the chair beside me, swinging her legs lightly beneath the table while studying my mother openly with childhood curiosity. Then she asked the question I should have expected eventually. Why haven't I met you before? The entire kitchen went silent. My mother looked at me instantly. Not for permission, for help. And in that moment, I realized something important. For the first time in 9 years, she wasn't trying to control the story anymore. She was afraid of telling it wrong. Then my mother answered Emma's question. And what she admitted next changed the entire direction of the night. The silence after Emma's question felt fragile. Not tense, just delicate. Like the entire room understood something important was balancing there. My mother looked down at the juice box in her hands for a second before answering. And honestly, I expected her to avoid the truth. To soften it. To hide behind vague adult language the way families usually do when children ask difficult questions. But she didn't. I made a mistake, she said quietly. Emma tilted her head slightly. Kids always expect explanations to be simpler than adults make them. What kind of mistake? My mother's eyes filled again immediately. And suddenly I understood something strange. This conversation was harder for her than the binder. Because documents only prove pain. Children force you to explain it. An explanation removes distance. My mother swallowed carefully. A really big one. Emma considered that answer seriously for a moment. Then asked, did you do something bad? Straightforward. No emotional strategy. No social protection. Just honesty. The kind adults spend years learning how to avoid. My mother nodded slowly. Yes. That single word changed the atmosphere completely. Because accountability sounds different when there's no defense attached to it. No. But. No. You have to understand. Just. Yes. Emma looked toward me briefly, probably checking whether she should feel uncomfortable. I kept my expression calm. Steady. Because despite how emotionally complicated this moment felt, I didn't want Emma carrying the weight of adult history yet. She forgot how to love people properly for a while, I said gently. My mother looked at me instantly after I said it. And something about her expression shifted. Not relief. Gratitude. Because I could have described those 9 years 100 harsher ways. And maybe she knew that. Emma accepted the explanation surprisingly fast. Children often do. They understand emotional truths more naturally than adults. Oh, she said quietly. Then took another sip from her juice box. No judgment. No dramatic reaction. Just processing. My mother let out a shaky breath while wiping beneath her eyes again. And for the first time all evening, the kitchen didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. Now it felt like something else. A beginning, maybe. Small, uncertain, but real. Emma studied my mother curiously for another moment before speaking again. Are you gonna come back? That question hit every adult in the room differently. For Emma, simple curiosity. For my mother, terror. For me, caution. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. And futures are harder than apologies. My mother looked at me carefully before answering. Not asking permission. Just aware that promises mattered differently now. If your mom wants me to. Good answer. Honest. Measured. No emotional manipulation hidden inside it. Emma nodded thoughtfully like negotiations between adults made perfect sense. Then she brightened suddenly. I have telescope pictures upstairs. The emotional whiplash almost made me laugh. 1 second. Generational trauma. Next second. Space photos. That's childhood. My mother smiled through tears. I'd love to see them. Emma looked toward me immediately for approval. I hesitated. Not because I wanted to say no. Because moments like this matter more than people realize. One decision can quietly reshape years. Finally, I nodded once. Okay. Emma jumped down from the chair instantly. Come on. She ran toward the hallway without waiting. My mother stayed frozen in her seat for half a second longer. Almost overwhelmed. Then slowly stood. And before following Emma, she looked back at me. Really looked at me. I don't deserve this, she whispered. That sentence landed harder than any apology could have. Because it was true. And she knew it. I leaned against the kitchen counter quietly. No, I said honestly. But she does. My mother closed her eyes briefly after that. And when she opened them again, something defensive inside her seemed completely gone. Not weakened. Gone. She followed Emma upstairs slowly. One hand lightly brushing the staircase rail like she needed grounding. I stayed alone in the kitchen for several minutes afterward. The binder still open. The debt list still folded beside it. 2 completely different versions of family sitting on the same table. And somewhere upstairs, I could hear Emma enthusiastically explaining planets while my mother listened between quiet emotional pauses. It should have felt satisfying. Maybe even victorious. But strangely, it didn't. Mostly it felt sad. Because none of this needed to happen this way. Not the silence. Not the rejection. Not the lost years. Pride simply grew larger than love for too long. And eventually everyone paid for it. I looked down at the binder again. Then slowly closed it for the first time that night. The sound echoed softly through the quiet kitchen. Final. Not because the pain disappeared. Because it no longer needed to be carried the same way. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed against the table. One new message. My father. Just 3 words. Is she there? I stared at the screen for several seconds, then looked upstairs toward the sound of Emma laughing faintly in her bedroom. And suddenly I understood something important. For 9 years, my father controlled every relationship in our family through silence. Now silence was finally being used against him instead. I locked the phone screen without answering, because for the first time, he could wait. An hour later, when my mother finally came downstairs, she made a decision about the debt list that I never expected her to make. I heard them before I saw them. Emma's footsteps first. Fast, light, followed by my mother moving slower behind her. And somehow that difference alone felt symbolic. Children move toward life naturally. Adults hesitate once they understand what things cost. Emma rushed into the kitchen carrying printed telescope photos in both hands. She likes Saturn best, my mother said softly from the hallway. Her voice sounded different now. Less guarded. Like spending an hour upstairs with a 7-year-old had quietly stripped away every remaining layer of performance. Emma spread the photos across the kitchen table enthusiastically. Blurry white dots against dark sky. Slightly crooked angles. Tiny circles labeled in pencil. To anyone else they probably looked unimpressive. But my mother studied each one carefully like museum artwork. And watching that hurt more than I expected, because she should have been here for years of moments like this already. Not discovering them all at once. Emma pointed excitedly at one photo. That one took me 3 tries. My mother smiled. You kept trying. Emma looked confused by the question. Yeah. Simple. Obvious. Of course you keep trying. Children don't understand giving up on people yet. That realization visibly hit my mother too. She looked down for a second before carefully setting the photos back onto the table. Then she reached toward the folded debt list beside the binder. Slowly, deliberately, my attention sharpened immediately. Because until now, that paper had remained strangely untouched. Like neither of us wanted to acknowledge why she originally came here. My mother picked it up, held it for a moment, then quietly tore it in half. Emma looked up instantly. So much for that, my mother whispered. The sound of paper ripping through the kitchen felt oddly emotional. Not dramatic, symbolic, because that list represented more than debt. It represented the entire reason she believed reconnecting was finally acceptable. Money reopened the relationship. Night created permission. And now, she was destroying the evidence of it herself. I watched carefully while she tore the pages again. And again, until the amounts disappeared into small, uneven pieces across the table. $925,000 reduced to scraps beside telescope photos and a navy binder. Emma blinked in confusion. Was that important? My mother looked at the torn paper for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said quietly. Just not in the way I thought. That line stayed with me, because I understood exactly what she meant. The money mattered when she believed survival was the crisis. But now she finally understood the real loss wasn't financial. It was relational. Time, trust, family, things that don't return once broken long enough. Emma slid off the chair. Can I show Grandma my moon lamp? The word landed heavily in the room. Grandma. Natural. Unforced. No emotional ceremony attached. Just acceptance. My mother looked genuinely stunned hearing it. And honestly, so was I. Because children decide connection differently than adults do. They care about presence, attention, kindness, not history. My mother nodded carefully. I'd like that very much. Emma grabbed her hand automatically and pulled her toward the hallway. My mother paused briefly before leaving the kitchen again. Then looked back at me. Not emotional this time. Clear. I'm not taking your money. I nodded once. I know. And surprisingly, I did. Because somewhere between the binder and Emma's telescope photos, the entire reason for the visit had transformed into something else. My mother disappeared upstairs again with Emma while I remained alone at the kitchen table. The house felt different now. Lighter maybe. Not healed. Healing is slower than that. But changed. I gathered the torn pieces of the debt list quietly into a small pile. Then looked toward the closed binder beside them. 9 years of grief. Documented carefully enough to survive memory. And now, suddenly, I wasn't sure I needed it anymore. That realization frightened me slightly. Because pain carried long enough becomes structure. You organize yourself around it. Build routines around it. Expectations, distance, and letting go of even part of it feels strangely vulnerable. My phone buzzed again. Same contact. My father. This time. Please answer. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then set the phone face down on the table. Still no reply. Not out of cruelty. Because some silences need to be experienced fully before people understand them. A little while later, my mother returned downstairs alone. Emma's footsteps continued faintly overhead while she played in her room again. My mother sat carefully back at the table. And now, for the first time all evening, there was no object sitting between us. No binder open. No debt list. Nothing to hide behind. She looked exhausted. Emotionally emptied out. I should have come years ago, she said quietly. Not defensive. Not asking forgiveness. Just the truth. I nodded slowly. Yes. The honesty of that answer seemed to affect her more than comfort would have. Because false reassurance would only protect the past again. And protecting the past was exactly what destroyed us in the first place. My mother looked toward the stairs where Emma's laughter echoed faintly again. Then back at me. Your father doesn't know how to fix this. Interesting wording. Not, he wants to fix this. Not, he's sorry. Just, he doesn't know how. And honestly, that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said all night. I leaned back quietly in my chair. Maybe he can't. The sentence stayed between us for several seconds. Heavy. Real. Because not every broken relationship gets repaired. Some only become understood. And maybe that has to be enough sometimes. My mother lowered her eyes briefly. Then finally whispered, I think he's afraid you won't forgive him. I looked toward the closed binder one last time. Then upstairs toward Emma's room. And for the first time in 9 years, I realized forgiveness might not actually be the hardest part anymore. Trust was. The next morning, my father showed up at my front door for the first time in 9 years. And he was carrying something I never expected to see in his hands. The next morning arrived quietly. No dramatic storm. No sleepless breakdown. Just soft light through the kitchen windows and the smell of coffee filling the house before Emma came downstairs for school. For a while, everything almost felt normal again. And honestly, that frightened me more than the confrontation did. Because after years of emotional distance, normal can feel unfamiliar. I stood at the sink rinsing Emma's lunch container when headlights rolled slowly into the driveway. Not fast. Not confident. Careful. I looked through the kitchen window immediately. And for a second, I genuinely didn't recognize the man stepping out of the car. Not because he looked different physically, because of what he was carrying. A cardboard storage box. Plain brown. Worn edges. Held carefully against his chest with both hands. My father stood beside the car for several seconds before approaching the porch. And for the first time in my life, he looked unsure of himself. Not weak, just human. Emma looked up from the table. Who's that? I stared through the window a second longer before answering. My dad. The room went quiet instantly. Not tense, just aware. Because even at 7 years old, Emma understood certain words carried emotional weight. There was no dramatic knock this time. Just one soft tap against the door. I opened it slowly. And suddenly there he was. 9 years older. Gray spreading heavily through his hair now. Lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. And underneath all the control he spent his life perfecting. Exhaustion. Real exhaustion. Neither of us spoke immediately. He looked past me once toward the kitchen, probably searching for signs of my mother. Or maybe signs he was already too late. Then his eyes returned to mine. And quietly, he held out the box. I think these belong to you. That sentence alone almost unraveled me emotionally. Because I already knew what was inside before I opened it. Memory has weight. Sometimes you recognize it before seeing it. I stepped aside silently. My father entered the house slowly, almost cautiously, carrying the box like something fragile enough to collapse if handled carelessly. Emma stayed seated at the kitchen table watching him openly. Curious, uncertain, but not afraid. My father noticed her immediately. And the exact moment he understood who she was. Everything in his face changed. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just complete emotional impact arriving all at once without warning. He started softly. Then stopped. Because the sentence couldn't finish itself. Emma looked toward me instinctively. I walked closer and rested a hand lightly against her shoulder. Emma, I said gently, this is my father. I almost repeated. Your grandfather. But just like yesterday with my mother. The word still felt too large to place casually into the room. Emma gave a small wave. Hi. My father stared at her like he was trying to process 7 years in 7 seconds. And honestly, maybe he was. He sat the storage box carefully on the kitchen table. Then slowly opened it. Inside were photographs. Cards. Letters. Every package I had ever mailed home after the wedding. Opened now. Finally. The top envelope still had my handwriting across the front. Slightly faded after years in storage. My chest tightened instantly. Because all this time, I thought those memories had been rejected completely. But they hadn't. They'd been hidden. Buried. Controlled. My father touched one photograph carefully with his fingertips. I couldn't throw them away, he admitted quietly. And there it was. The truth beneath 9 years of silence. Not hatred. Cowardice. Fear disguised as authority. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting he loved his daughter more than he loved the image of his family. My father looked toward me again. And for the first time in my entire life, he looked ashamed. Not defensive. Not angry. Ashamed. I thought if I stood firm long enough, he said slowly, you would come back and apologize. I almost laughed at the tragedy of it. 9 years. destroyed over two people waiting for the other one to move first. Emma looked between us quietly, clearly sensing emotions too large for her to understand completely. My father noticed her again, and whatever walls remained inside him finally broke. Tears filled his eyes instantly. Not controlled tears either. The kind people fail to stop once regret finally catches them completely unprepared. "I missed all of it," he whispered. That sentence hit harder than every speech, every church judgment, every rejection letter combined. Because it was true. He missed all of it. The apartment above the laundromat. The hospital nights. The birth of my daughter. The company. The survival. The life. All because pride convinced him love had conditions attached. The kitchen stayed completely silent except for my father trying unsuccessfully to steady his breathing. And strangely, I didn't feel victorious watching it. Just sad. Because once enough time disappears, nobody actually wins anymore. Emma slid quietly off her chair, then walked around the table toward him. She stopped beside his chair, studied him carefully for 1 second, then handed him one of her telescope pictures. Saturn, slightly blurry, crooked angle. "My mom says people make mistakes when they're scared," she said softly. My father took the picture with shaking hands and completely fell apart. Head lowered, shoulders shaking. 9 years of control collapsing in the middle of my kitchen while a 7-year-old handed him a photograph of a planet. And somehow, that felt exactly right. Because children reduce complicated emotional disasters back into simple truths. Love people while you still can. That's it. That's the entire lesson. Nothing else survives time very well. I looked at the open storage box one last time, then at the binder still resting quietly near the edge of the kitchen table. 2 archives. One preserving pain, the other preserving love badly hidden behind pride. And suddenly I understood something important. Families don't usually break from one terrible moment. They break from small silences repeated long enough to become identity. But sometimes, if people are willing to carry the truth honestly enough, they can begin again too. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. And honestly, after 9 years, that was more than I ever expected to get back. Because sometimes the people who hurt you most aren't the ones who stopped loving you. They're the ones who confused love with control, until time finally showed them the difference.